We can speak now to Daniel Benaim, who is a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs and former Middle East advisor to the then Vice President Joe Biden. He joins us from Washington. Mr. Benaim, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House today, holding talks with President Trump. I mean, what do you think the main message he brought with him was with regards to Iran?
I think he's trying to make clear to President Trump what Israel's priorities here are. Now, President Trump has said that he would help the Iranian people under duress when they were protesting out in the streets, and he's now, having been cornered, trying to create some U.S. leverage. Netanyahu is trying to advocate for how he should use that military leverage that Trump is creating. I think Netanyahu is quite concerned about Iran's ballistic missiles and most likely doesn't want to see a nuclear understanding between the United States and Iran that leaves some of these other Iranian capabilities intact. Whereas President Trump, who's looking for an off-ramp to avoid another round of military strikes, may be more interested in that kind of nuclear diplomacy. So Netanyahu is trying to level set as that diplomacy continues and to make sure that both countries are aligned if the diplomacy fails and U.S. military strikes proceed.
Right, so how do you rate Netanyahu's chances with regards to pressuring President Trump to widen the talks beyond the nuclear issue?
Well, you can see even in the different statements by different U.S. officials, different degrees of emphasis beyond the nuclear. Rubio has talked about including missiles and proxies. Vance really recently kept the focus on the nuclear program. So I think there is a real internal debate and discussion by the looks of it from outside. And I think at a moment like that, an Israeli prime minister coming to Washington can have a lot of impact. I do think ultimately it comes up to President Trump, who has his own kind of unsentimental view of Israel and of American self-interest and will do what he thinks is best for the United States in this situation while giving Israel's opinion a heavy weight.
Right. I mean, why is it that Prime Minister Netanyahu is so concerned about Iran's ballistic missiles? What's the scale of this particular threat?
Well, if you're Netanyahu, you've already taken a sledgehammer to Iran's nuclear program. You've already begun dismantling their proxies. And what's really left is the third leg of the stool, which is Iran's ability to deter aggression against itself and intimidate other states. Now, there's sort of different ranges at work here. There's an arsenal that can strike Israel. And I think Israel is quite worried that that strike could overwhelm Israel, and they want to maintain dominance, and they don't want to be deterred from that. And they don't want that threat hanging over them. There's also an even larger arsenal that can strike American bases in the Gulf. So I think Israel is most concerned about the ones that can strike Israel, whereas the United States has a more varied set of interests and maybe a different calculus when it comes to deterrence.
Right, and I don't know if you saw the images that were analysed by the New York Times, but they seem to show that Iran has been very quick to do some repairs on the ballistic missile facilities that were damaged last year by the Israelis, but not done very much at all, really, to the nuclear sites that were damaged or destroyed. I mean, what does that tell us?
I think it says a few things. One, it says that Iran is pretty boxed in on the nuclear front. There are a finite number of nuclear sites that are really the center of gravity of that program, and they're by and large known to the world. That is harder to reconstruct than missile sites, which are much less complicated technology, much easier to spread out, put underground, et cetera. So I think it also tells you that Iran really views their missiles at this point as kind of the key remaining pillar in their architecture of deterrence. Having lost their proxies since October 7th, this is really what's left for them. Their air defenses were shown to be an absolute paper tiger in the face of Israeli and then American air power. So what's left is a missile deterrent, and I think they'll be very reluctant to give that away because they know that they have nothing left, and they've seen that even in the midst of diplomacy with the United States, they're still vulnerable to a U.S. and Israeli military strike.
Okay, so that's what Israel's desired outcome is from all of this. Listening to the Iranian side, the country's president saying, we will not yield to excessive demands. I mean, from what you're saying and from what we're hearing from US officials in the current administration is that Iran really isn't in any position at all to be calling the shots here, is it?
No, that's right. They're not. But what they have is kind of the power of the weak, in the sense that they are willing to take risks and to maybe even absorb a military attack rather than capitulate on a series of maximal demands when it comes to their missile program and activities in the region. Now, we may say that they should do that and that they have a chance to rescue their economy and give their regime a new lease on life if they were to sign on to some restrictions to certain security programs to allow sanction relief and other things. But the fact is, that's not how they see their country and their role in the world. They're a revolutionary power, even albeit a tired one with very old leaders and a real legitimacy problem. But Ayatollah Khomeini once said, we didn't launch this revolution to change the price of watermelons. And I think we have to understand that they have that mentality and they're afraid of looking weak in front of their own people. Right now, the reason that they're still in power is because they crushed these demonstrations brutally and horrifically. And I think they would be quite afraid that if they capitulated fully to the United States, they would look even weaker in front of their own people. So a solution that might look technically easy or beneficial to all sides is unlikely to be taken by the Iranian leadership because of who they are and how they see the world.
I mean, what do you think the United States really wants here? Because, I mean, this looks like a once-in-a-generation opportunity to perhaps bring about significant changes to the leadership in Iran. President Trump will be under pressure from the diaspora within the United States, which is large and audible. He'll be hearing appeals from segments of the population within Iran itself that we've just been talking about, many of whom took to the streets earlier on this year. I mean, what do you think he wants to see happen here?
I think you've really put your finger on one of the areas of real confusion. It's good to want things in foreign policy, but foreign policy is about matching ends and means. What are you going to do to achieve what outcome? Now, I think Donald Trump would love to see the Iranian regime toppled by its own people and to have a small amount of U.S. air power and limited risk achieve that objective. But there's not much indication that the Iranian regime is just going to capitulate or fracture or crack and do that. So far, you've seen them hold together in the face of these protests and prove willing to kill lots of people. So the question is, how do you match ends with means? I think, yes, they would like to see that, but they're unwilling to take the kinds of risks or assertive action that would lead to that. And I think they're unwilling for good reason, in fact. Failing that, I think they may look for diplomacy, but the problem with diplomacy is that it's a stab in the back to the Iranian people to deal behind their backs with this regime. So that is how you default to a military strike that may not achieve very much because the other options prove too difficult to achieve in real time. And that's why at the start of this kind of effort, you want to make sure you do know what you want and you've weighed these various equities in a way that it's not clear to me that they have.
Okay, now all the while dialogue is sort of in progress. This latest round of talks took place in Oman on Friday with regards to Iran's nuclear ambitions. I mean, it seems those talks went quite well from, what we can read between the lines. I mean, are you surprised they went as well as they seem to have done?
No, because we really don't know exactly how well they went. We don't know if Iran offered anything more than a kind of token effort on their nuclear program. And we don't know if the United States, when push comes to shove, is actually willing to narrow down and just focus on the nuclear program. Anything bigger than the nuclear program is a gigantic piece of work that's going to require verification and detail of a kind that's very hard to pair with gunboat diplomacy of an American armada sitting outside and giving a tight deadline to come to something. So I am pretty skeptical that diplomacy here is going to provide anything more than maybe at best a near-term off-ramp, but we'll have to see.
I mean, could there be an element of the US buying a bit of time here? Because there is talk perhaps of even sending a second aircraft carrier to the region. I mean, could that be the best way to look at this?
Yeah, I think time is a very important factor here. Time also allows more air interceptors and other defenses to come into the region to make sure that we're ready to defend against Iranian aggression. And I think that's part of why there wasn't an initial wave of strikes while Iranians were still in the streets when President Trump made what have so far been idle threats that he would punish the Iranian regime and help the Iranian people. So I do think time buys that. And also time puts you past the Olympics, which is a time when Countries historically have been reluctant to launch aggression with the eyes of the world on them. So there may be a desire to get past that in 10 days or a couple of weeks and allow a kind of mutual agreement to allow diplomacy to take its course in that time before we get somewhere else. The point is, I'm not sure that diplomacy here has real legs, and I think we'll have to see. It may be that everybody wants to give it out or to buy time using diplomacy, but that's not the same as saying that diplomacy will accomplish some bigger objective of the kind that Netanyahu is here to discuss, or the kind that the United States has set as its goal.
Right, overnight, President Trump said he thinks Iran would be very foolish not to accept a deal. He said that something very tough would happen if Iran does refuse. Were that to happen, Iran says it would retaliate, and we'd be looking at a wider war. How wide?
That's the real question. People who speak with certainty about what will happen in the face of a war like this, you shouldn't trust. Nobody knows. In last June, we were able to contain this kind of escalation to a kind of token strike into Doha, which was dangerous, to be clear, but also contained ultimately. Iran may feel that this time they have nothing to lose and they need to show that they can't be hit repeatedly and that they have to do more. But they also have no air defenses and will be mindful that if they do something like that, they may face a 10 times worse barrage from the United States. The problem again here is, what's the political objective that military strikes are achieving? If you don't have that, it can be very hard to gauge the success of those strikes. I would guess that strikes are still more likely than not, however, because Trump is signaling that they're the alternative to diplomacy, and I would rate that diplomacy has a lower chance of success than even.
Okay, so just to sort of bring this conversation to a conclusion, President Trump saying he's ready to send more military material to the region. Talks taking place in Oman, talks taking place at the White House. In your opinion, has the chance of conflict gone up or down during the course of the last week?
I'd say when you have the sides talking, that is an indication that they may look for an off-ramp here. And I would say that that probably lowers the odds. However, at every turn you have Donald Trump essentially saying it's either diplomacy, a diplomatic deal, or a war. And there's no third option. And so that pressure play tells me that war is a real possibility, and that given what I've said about a diplomatic deal and the difficulties of a satisfactory diplomatic deal, I think the odds of war are meaningful, and everybody should be prepared for the possibility that that war escalates into the wider region.
Clearly, Iran wants a deal.
Do they? I'm not so sure. I think they want time and space. And if it takes them a deal to do it, they'll do it. Some people in the Iranian system might want economic relief, but I think others are comfortable with the sanctions, and they're comfortable with the idea that their government is a bulwark against the West and the United States. That's how they've sold themselves to their people. And absent that, if they are capitulating on issues of national security or national pride, in their view, they may look less legitimate. So I would think that what Iran really wants is time above all. And they're willing to engage in negotiation and maybe even sign a deal to buy that time to reconstitute and recoup.
All right. We really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. Daniel Benaim, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Well, for more, we're joined now by Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, who is a retired British Army officer and former senior Middle East advisor at the Ministry of Defence. And also, I should add, author, amongst other books, author of Soldier in the Sand. He joins us now from London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Sir Simon. I just want to start by asking you, clearly a lot's been happening with regards to Iran since the start of the year. Would you say we're looking closer at this particular moment to conflict with Iran than we were, say, 6 months ago?
Yes, I would. We were close to it, and we had the 12-day war, as it's called, last year, Tom, which followed on from, of course, Israeli strikes earlier. There's a very big task force has been gathered by the Americans, no doubt planning with allies, not least, obviously, the Israelis. And there is a feeling of frustration that we've been here many times before with the Iranians. playing games and trying to sit it out. Very understandable if you are based in Tehran. There is a case, though, that the dissent within the country, the economic weakness, the water problems they've got, the illegitimacy now of the regime having massacred so many of its own people, does leave it ripe for a strike. There would be consequences, of course, but certainly there are drumbeats towards more military action, and there'll be a whole spectrum of various plans and the consequences thereof that are being looked at the moment by planners and of course, policymakers and politicians.
So you're painting a picture of a very vulnerable leadership in Tehran. What do you think the US president's desired outcome is here with regards to Iran's future?
Well, I think ultimately the priority for almost all people who would say live in the Middle East, let alone look at it and observe it and have a deep affection for it in its widest sense, is stability. One of the great causes of volatility and instability for decades has been the regime in Iran. I think all of us, in an ideal situation, should I say, other people may have some other ideas, would be a transition to a much more benign regime there that looks after its own people and ceases to interfere in other areas of the Middle East. That might be difficult. I think the Iranian regime is very well entrenched. There are an awful lot of people who believe in it ideologically or religiously or who have vested interests in it. So its capacity still to deal with any internal dissent remains. But it is brittle, it is fragile, it offers absolutely nothing to the people of Iran or the region. And everybody's trying to find a way that we might get a transition to a more benign regime, both on behalf of the Iranian people and, as I say, the whole region.
Do you think it's fair to say the United States has been fairly restrained this time around? And if you'd agree with that statement, what do you think's behind that? Why the seeming restraint up until this point?
I think they'll be warned, as the Americans were in 2002-03, about the potential consequences of not thinking through military action. Iran is a big state, it's an important state, it's a great civilization. The capacity for all sorts of untold consequences, instability, environmental catastrophe, strikes, if any action against Iran proved to have been misjudged, are very high. And anybody embarking on military operations has to think very long and hard about what you want to achieve by it and what the potential consequences could be. And the Americans and a lot of us, I suppose, feel very fingers burned by the consequences of the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
The United States has quite considerable military resources in the region as things stand. President Trump floating the idea of perhaps sending a second aircraft carrier strike group to the region. And at the same time, there has been dialogue. There were talks held in Oman on Friday. By all accounts, those talks went well as can be expected. But what do you think the effect is of negotiations, diplomacy with that kind of military force not so very far in the distance?
Well, I think the Iranian leadership should be very careful. As I say, there may be bad consequences for everybody else, but there will certainly be bad consequences for the regime. They're very good at using the nuclear file as a way of diverting attention from their ballistic missile program and, dare I say, their parasitical, malign influence in places like Iraq, in Syria until the fall of Assad, clearly through Hezbollah, the support of Hamas and the Houthis. And in many cases, people have at least accused the Iranians of using it like a magician, on one hand, to use the nuclear file as a way of diverting attention from their other activities. But they are extremely weak at the moment, relatively speaking, and they are aware of that weakness. And the events consequent to the 7th of October have put them in a very weak position relatively, both to their Arab neighbors and particularly the state of Israel. And the Americans will find it difficult to keep a large armada in place for too long. and will be very conscious that the Iranians will try and play out this negotiation as long as they can in order to secure their position at home, and hope that the American armada will dissipate under a lack of attention or requirements elsewhere. So there's also a window in which they can negotiate. And they need to be their feet held very close to the fire, that there needs to be an outcome from these discussions, not more prevarication.
I mean, I think we can be fairly sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's at the White House today, will be telling the president to broaden the scope of discussion beyond the nuclear file and perhaps focus on Iran's, as you said, you've mentioned the proxies already, but also the ballistic missiles that Iran has. What was the scale of Iran's threat when it comes to these ballistic missiles?
It's quite difficult to tell in some ways, because we did see them exercise some of that capability, during, as it were, in the lead up to the 12-day war, when they launched a lot of ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv, at Israel and Tel Aviv. And I know that they still have many more. One can argue or discuss what damage they actually did. I suspect up to a point it's overstated, but in a closely packed environment as Israel is, or dare I say, other parts of the Gulf states, if they chose to widen the conflict, the capacity to cause all sorts of problems, desalination plants, oil refineries, oil pipelines, let alone civilian centers, would be huge. And there is a sort of messianic element to Iran that is all for pulling down the temple on top of themselves and their neighbors were circumstances to really act against the Islamic Republic.
So how do you rate Prime Minister Netanyahu's chances of persuading President Trump to broaden the scope of discussions beyond just nuclear?
I think quite high. I think there'll be very receptive audience in Washington. Let's remember, Trump had been through 4 years of this before. American policymakers have been watching this since 1979. There is a case now with Hamas weakened, Hezbollah weakened, and Iran weakened, that when you weigh up the odds, you might decide that this is the time. Now, interestingly, in the nature of having been around and young enough or old enough to watch the revolutionary movement against the Shah, what happens often is you have crimes committed by the state, was the Shah, now the regime, and every 40 days you'll get another outburst of popular uprising. We reached that 40 days since the 8th, 9th of January, fun enough, this weekend. And a combination of strikes on the Iranian command and control hierarchy, combined with another mass demonstration of discontent, would be a very, very potent combination against which the regime might find itself very, very much on the ropes.
And yet the Iranian president continues to say things like, we will not yield to excessive demands. I mean, do you think they realize the severity, potentially, of the sort of situation they find themselves in, like the one you just described?
I do, actually, Tom. I think they're very, very conscious. When the only way to suppress public dissent is to kill, take a figure, 30,000 of your own people, every one of whom will have family who will have been affected by those deaths, those casualties, those imprisonments, torture, you name it. And economically, there's actually no way of growing the economy, that water is beginning to stress you, that people are going to have to move. You are left with rhetoric and the capacity, of course, to do a lot of collateral damage if attacked. So it doesn't surprise me the Iranians are trying to use or bolster a weak position by using very, very aggressive language. And the president, of course, is very beholden to the IRGC and the Supreme Council, who are very, very motivated. They're not looking at the world through the same lens that we are, or even Sunni Arab leadership on the other side of the Gulf.
If Iran is attacked by the United States and or Israel, obviously they're going to retaliate. And I'd just like to ask you to help us understand what sort of a wider war such retaliation might end up triggering.
Well, the big headline worry, Tom, and you'll have reported on this before, is, of course, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Alongside that, you could end up with an enormous environmental damage in the Strait, in the Gulf. You could end up, if Iran wished to broaden its response to attacks on desalination plants, as I said, and refineries. There'd be a huge jolt, of course, to the global economic system if you cut off, for any extended length of period, 20% of the energy supplies of oil and gas coming out of the Strait. It would all be dealable with, but then you would worry, of course, inevitably about the runover of perhaps the energizing their proxies, the Shia militia in Iraq, Al-Qaeda, who of course will make common cause against Israel and the West, Islamic State, Hamas, Hezbollah. So the capacity to make life extremely complicated there is huge, and will of course have been red teamed and war gamed endlessly. And has been, to be honest with you, for decades, because this is, even when I was in the Ministry of Defense in 2009, the great cry was, what worries us more, Iran with a bomb or a bombed Iran? So we have been confronted with this for decades. And so what we would all love, as I say, is a change of regime in Iran, or a changed behavior by the current regime, but equally not the regional catastrophe, volatility that you refer to.
You make it clear there, this is none of it new. These issues are long-standing and ones that you were discussing 15 plus years ago in London. I mean, why do you think successive administrations in the United States have seemingly kicked the can down the road and not taken the bull by the horns?
Well, inevitably, the US, like all of us, have electoral cycles. They have domestic agendas. I think the experience of Iraq has been very sobering on policymakers. War is extremely expensive in blood and treasure. The Iranians are very canny. They're a veiled civilization with a very, very strong sense of national identity and civilizational pride. They're very clever at negotiation. They've been very clever at sort of leveraging a position of weakness. But there are times, as you say, when you get Netanyahu and Trump together at this particular junction with a weak regime whose acolytes have been heavily hit in the aftermath of 7th October, that may make people say this might be the time to do it. It would be a question of what you then hope might happen having struck. And of course, there'll be a massive spectrum. It's what military planners are paid to do. Give me any number of options from zero to hero on what you can do. It takes time to assemble it, and what you think might be the consequences if you're linking it to your political objectives, Clausewitzian.
I mean, in the last 18 months, we've kind of got the impression that Israeli intelligence on Iran is so high grade that the whole country is essentially compromised in one way or another. And I'm just wondering why you think there's any hesitation not to put that intel to use and to carry out extremely targeted operations that would, bring about the end of this current administration in Tehran.
Well, I think one's got to be then honest. You might apply to British politics at the moment. No one wants to defenestrate Starmer because we're not entirely sure what would come afterwards. This is the problem in Iran. There's deliberately no recognizable opposition to rally round. One's got to be very careful of people like Reza Pahlavi, obviously son of the last Shah, who sits outside Iran. Before we went into Iraq in 2003, a man called Ahmed Chalabi was going around saying, well, it'll all be great if you can get rid of the Saddam, everybody will rise up, they'll be laying down roses as you drive to Baghdad. It's a real coalition of people who dislike the regime and the IRGC and the Basij, etc. but would have very, very differing views about what should come afterwards. And it would be very difficult. We haven't had anybody who's come up really with a coherent program of what reform could look like. You've also in Iran got always the difficulty that the Azeris up in the north, areas that are Turkic, the Kurdish areas, the Baloch areas, the Arab areas around Khurram Shah, could all break away. And then you are left with a very divided, split country. So in many ways, what you want is a regime to behave more stably, be less parasitical and aggressive in its relationships across the region, and stop violently oppressing its own people. Because it's not regime change itself. You want a regime in Tehran that can manage a post-regime Iran, or a regime that just is prepared to reform itself. Neither look terribly likely in the current circumstances.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.